So today's topic is this: we grow together in groups. And today I want to share with you how growing together in small groups of people is a strategy that has been deployed in the Bible from beginning to end. When I started working on my message this week, I just asked myself a question. I wonder where we would see small groups of people growing together, spiritually growing together in the Bible. So I started digging into it, and I was surprised to find that it appears that small groups ministry is a strategy that was God's idea, and it came clear at the beginning and goes throughout the scriptures. And I want to share that with you today. We're going to start with Passover. If you've got your notes, you see that we're going to start with Passover. But before we get there, I want to give you a background of Passover. I think most people, whether you're a church person or not, most people kind of have a vague idea of what Passover is. If you've read the Old Testament, you probably have a better idea of what it is. But if you don't know much about Passover, I want to give you a background of Passover before we really dissect it and how it relates to growing together in a group. So I want to share with you a video from the Bible Project. How many of you have used Bible Project resources from time to time? Okay, not a lot of us, some of us. Let me tell you, the Bible Project is one of the best Bible resources that I know of. Noah is vigorously shaking his head in the front row. If you don't know the Bible Project, man, it is such a great Bible resource. And this video is going to be about 5 minutes long, so it's a little lengthy. But the reason I'm sharing this with you is twofold. One of our values that I talked about a few weeks ago is that we make the Bible understandable. The Bible Project makes the Bible understandable. Would you agree, Noah? Vigorous head shaking. Okay? And if you need to understand the Bible and you have a hard time, this is somewhere you can go. So I kind of want to give you a flavor of what the Bible Project is like, but specifically, we're going to stop when we get to Passover, and then we'll talk about what that is. But this will just give you a long background on what Passover is all about. All right, roll that beautiful bean footage.
The book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Bible, and it picks up the storyline from the previous book, Genesis, which ended with Abraham's grandson, Jacob, leading his large family of 70 people down to Egypt. Now, Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, had been elevated to second in command over Egypt, and he had saved his whole family in a famine. And so Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, offered the family to come live there as a safe haven. And so eventually Jacob dies there in Egypt, and Joseph and all his brothers do too. About 400 years pass, and the story of the Exodus begins. Now, that name refers to the event that takes place in the first half of the book, Israel's exodus from Egypt. But the book has a second half that takes place at the foot of Mount Sinai. In this video, we'll just focus on the first half, where centuries have passed, and the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied, and they filled the land. Now, this line is a deliberate echo back to the blessing that God gave all humanity back in the Garden of Eden. And it reminds us of the big biblical story so far. Humanity forfeited God's blessing through sin and rebellion, and so God chose Abraham's family as the vehicle through which he would restore his blessing to all the world. But the new Pharaoh does not view Israel as a blessing. He actually thinks this growing Israelite immigrant group is a threat to his power. And so just as in Genesis, humanity rebels against God's blessing, so here Pharaoh attempts to destroy the source of God's blessing, the Israelites. He brutally enslaves them in forced labor, and then he orders that all the Israelite boys be drowned in the Nile River. Now, Pharaoh, he is the worst character in the Bible so far. His kingdom epitomizes humanity's rebellion against God. Pharaoh has so redefined good and evil according to his own interests that even the murder of innocent children has become good to him. And so Egypt has become worse than Babylon from the book of Genesis. And so now Israel cries out for help against this new Babylon, and God responds. God first turns Pharaoh's evil upside down as an Israelite mother throws her boy into the Nile River, but in a basket. And so he floats safely right down into Pharaoh's own family. He's named Moses, and he grows up to eventually become the man that God will use to defeat Pharaoh. Pharaoh's evil. In the famous story of the burning bush, God appears to Moses and commissions him to go to Pharaoh and order him to release the Israelites. And God says that he knows Pharaoh will resist, and so he will bring his judgment on Egypt in the form of plagues. Then God also says that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. And so we're introduced into the next main part of the story, the confrontation between God and Pharaoh. Now, what does this mean that God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart? It's super important to read this section of the story really closely and in sequence. In Moses and Pharaoh's first encounter, we're told simply that Pharaoh's heart grew hard. There's no implication that God did anything. And so in response, God sends the first set of 5 plagues, each one confronting Pharaoh and one of his Egyptian gods. And each time, Moses offers a chance for Pharaoh to humble himself and to let the Israelites go. But after each plague, we're told that Pharaoh either hardened his heart or that his heart grew hard. He's doing this of his own will. And so eventually, it's with the second set of 5 plagues that we begin to hear how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So the point of the story seems to be this. Even though God knew that Pharaoh would resist his will, God still offered him all of these chances to do the right thing. But eventually, Pharaoh's evil reaches a point of no return. I mean, even his own advisors think that he has lost his mind. And it's at that point that God takes over and bends Pharaoh's evil towards his own redemptive purposes. God lures Pharaoh into his own destruction as he saves his people, which is what happens next. With the final plague, it's the night of Passover, and God turns the tables on Pharaoh. Just as he killed the sons of the Israelites, so God will kill the firstborn in Egypt with a final plague. But unlike Pharaoh, God provides a means of escape through the blood of the Lamb. And here the story stops and introduces us in detail to the annual Israelite ritual of Passover. On the night before Israel left Egypt, they sacrificed a young, spotless lamb and painted its blood on the doorframe of their house. And when the divine plague came over Egypt, the houses covered with the blood of the lamb were passed over, and the sons spared. And so every year since, the Israelites have reenacted that night to remember and to celebrate God's justice and his mercy. But Pharaoh, because of his pride and rebellion, he loses his own son, and he's compelled to finally let the Israelites go free. And so the Israelite slaves make their exodus from Egypt. But no sooner do they leave that Pharaoh changes his mind, and he gathers his army and chases after the Israelites for a final showdown. As the Israelites pass through the waters of the sea safely, Pharaoh charges towards his own destruction. The Exodus story concludes with the first song of praise in the Bible. It's called the Song of the Sea. And the final line declares that the Lord reigns as king. And then the song retells in poetry what the story of God's kingdom is all about. It's about how God is on a mission to confront evil in his world and to redeem those who are enslaved to evil. God is going to bring his people into the promised land where his divine presence will live among them. This story is what it looks like when God becomes king over his people.
Okay, so much in there, right? And I don't have time this morning to unpack everything, but I want to zero in this morning on the idea of Passover and how this relates to our strategy for spiritual growth. What I see here in the Passover story is that from the very beginning, we see God's people meeting as large assemblies as well as small groups. And this is really the first time in the Bible that we read about these two things happening. And so the first thing that I want you to know about Passover, the first Passover, was that the entire assembly of Israel gathered to hear Moses, who told them God's message. Moses had met with God. Moses told the people what they needed to know, what they needed to do, what was coming, and how they could avoid judgment. And so they all gathered to hear Moses tell them about God's message. And then they gathered in homes as families to observe the ceremonies of Passover. Now, this is what's cool. If you go and read all the details in the book of Exodus, you find out that not every family had the resources to be able to hold a Passover celebration. And so families who had more were instructed to open their homes and widen their tables to welcome their neighbors to join with them to celebrate Passover and to remember what God was doing. And this is the thing that I want you to know. This was really the very first small group. I just messed up my notes here. There we go. If people didn't have enough, they could go to their neighbors and celebrate with another family. And so it wasn't just families celebrating by themselves. It was communities splitting up into small groups. This was the very first small group. Now, here's what I want you to hear. And Tim Mackey, in the narration of that video we just watched, said this. This was the purpose of celebrating Passover that took place year after year after year after year and is still taking place today. The purpose of celebrating Passover was to remember and to celebrate God's justice and his mercy. I want you to really absorb that this morning. The purpose of celebrating Passover was to remember and to celebrate God's justice and his mercy. This is one of the things that was an aha moment for me this week as I was studying. There was a connection. I don't know if you've made this connection before, but Pharaoh had committed this absolutely terrible atrocity of genocide. He had tried to wipe out the firstborn male of every Jewish family by drowning them in the river. And so when the death angel came with God's justice, the death angel came for the firstborn of every person in the land. But here's what's extraordinary. He gave a way of escape. This is his mercy. If you painted your doorpost with the blood of the lamb, you would be passed over. Did you pick this up? And did you pick up the connection between the judgment and the crime that Pharaoh had committed? It was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But unlike Pharaoh, who didn't offer anybody any kind of mercy, every person who painted the blood of the lamb on their doorposts would be passed over, including Egyptian people. Did you know that? The promise of mercy wasn't just for the Israelites. Pharaoh had the opportunity to be passed over as well, but he declined God's mercy. And so he suffered God's justice. Now, to this day, Jews all over the world, Orthodox Jews, non-Orthodox Jews, Messianic Jews, celebrate Passover all over the world. I'm just curious, how many of you have ever been to a Seder meal? Okay, oh, lots of you. Okay, I've had an opportunity several times to attend a Seder meal. Seder meal is the first meal of the Passover celebration. And it's just rich in tradition and history. And one of the things when I've attended a Seder meal that I've been struck by is the focus on children. Do you remember this? Those of you that have been to a Seder meal, there's all kinds of activities for kids to do. They hide a matzah cracker in a napkin, and then there's a prize for the kid that finds that matzah cracker, and then they're explained what that symbolizes and all of this kind of stuff. And the reason that children have such an important role in the celebration of the Seder meal is this. Passover has the purpose of remembering, and the reason we remember is because we are passing on the God story to the next generation. And this is what happens when small groups gather for the purpose of spiritual growth. We're passing on the God story to the next generation of Christ followers. And it's critically important that this is a part of every Christian's life experience. Because if we don't pass on God's story to the people that are just coming into the fellowship, or passing it on to our children, or passing it on to people that just don't know, then we are falling down on our responsibility to help God's kingdom expand. And so that last line I want you to remember, the purpose of Passover is to remember and to celebrate God's justice and his mercy. Now, what we're doing in this series, we're calling this series hashtag This Is Who We Are. And I've realized that every once in a while it's important for us to remind ourselves of who we are. So for the last 9 or 10 weeks, we've been talking about our values and our purposes here at Connect. We've talked about a whole bunch of things. We're family. We're on a rescue mission. We make the Bible understandable. Today we're talking about this value that we have at Connect of growing together, spiritual growth that takes place in groups. And I want to share with you today why I'm sharing this particular message. This is my aim for Connect Church. And this week, more than any other week, this is a big aim. This is what it is. My aim is that every single connector will participate in a small group where spiritual growth is pursued. Now, when I say it's a big aim because I know we're a church. I don't know, I haven't looked at our statistics recently exactly, but we probably have 300 people who come to Connect on a regular basis. We're not all together every single Sunday, but we've got about 300 people. But we only have, I don't know, maybe 70 or 80 people who are in small groups on a consistent basis. And today, what I want to share with you is I want to aim bigger because I believe so strongly, not just in the biblical principle of spiritual growth being pursued in small groups, but also in the fact that for me and for many of you, the most accelerated period of spiritual growth in our lives has been when we've been meeting in small groups. I want you to grow. I want you to become everything Jesus has created you to be. And I believe one of the strategies, it's not the only strategy, but one of the strategies that's most effective is gathering in a small group where spiritual growth is pursued. So we see that happening with Passover. Now I want to fast forward to the time of Jesus. 13 or 1400 years have passed from the time of Passover until the time of Jesus. And I don't know if it's ever struck you as extraordinary, but when we get to the New Testament account of Jesus, we find that the Jewish people are still celebrating Passover. Just like they did it in Moses' day, they're still celebrating Passover. Can you think of anything else that has existed for 13 or 1400 years uninterrupted? Passover has. And we find that Jesus celebrates Passover with his 12 disciples. This account, this story is told in the Gospels. It's also told in 1 Corinthians. And so we see all of these different perspectives of this the celebration of Passover that Jesus led. And when we read about Jesus celebrating Passover, it turns out he gathers his 12 disciples to celebrate Passover. You know that Jesus had many more disciples, right? We know that Jesus had a group of 70 that followed him and listened to his teaching on a regular basis. We know that sometimes he would teach to thousands of people on a mountainside where they could gather and they could hear him. He had many, many followers, but for Passover, he gathered with his small group. Isn't that interesting? Small group started with Moses at Passover. Now we see Jesus gathering with just a small group of his disciples to celebrate Passover. And this is what happens. I think this is so fascinating because Jesus takes the celebration of Passover that has been uninterrupted for 1400 years and he turns it on its head. All of a sudden, Passover, he says, is fulfilled in himself. Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that Passover pointed to. All of a sudden, we find that the bread wasn't just bread. The bread was actually Jesus. The wine that they drank at Passover, and if you've been to a Seder meal, you know there's a lot of wine. The wine that they drank at the Seder meal wasn't just about wine. The wine was about the blood of the Lamb. And it turns out that the Lamb is Jesus. And all of these things connect in this beautiful night that we call the Last Supper. It was the Seder meal of the week of Passover that Jesus celebrated with his small group. And Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that Passover promised. I want to read the account from 1 Corinthians of that night. Here's what we read. It's up on the screen. On the night when Jesus was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took some bread and he gave thanks to God for it, and then he broke it in pieces and he said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this to remember me." Everybody say the word remember. Where did we talk about remembering before? Passover. What were we remembering with Passover? We were remembering the justice and the mercy of God. Now Jesus says, do this to remember what? Remember me. See how it all turns on Jesus. A lot of historians say that Jesus is the fulcrum of history. Everything pivots with Jesus, and I believe it's absolutely true. Next verse. In the same way, Jesus took the cup of wine after supper and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood. Do this to remember me as often as you drink it. For every time you eat this bread and drink this cup, you are announcing the Lord's death until he comes again." And that word announcing means I am passing on this information to other people. I am passing on this information to my kids and to my grandkids. I'm passing on this information to new believers, to people who don't yet know everything there is to know about Jesus. It's a direct correlation of that remembering the justice and the mercy of God to now remembering the justice and mercy of God expressed in Jesus. And it's so important that this is a part of who we are. And listen, we celebrate communion most often in a large group gathering, but Jesus started it with his small group. Isn't that interesting? And the purpose that Jesus said was to remember Jesus' new covenant. What's interesting is it's still a covenant of justice and mercy. But the new covenant, so beautiful. Listen to me, friends. The new covenant, God's mercy is so far outweighing his judgment. In fact, he says, I'm taking your sins and I'm removing them from you as far as the east is from the west. His mercy is so big. His mercy is so huge. This new covenant, the lamb isn't just slain by Israelites anymore. Jesus becomes the Lamb of God for the sins of the whole world. Every one of us have access to the mercy of God because of the new covenant of Jesus. Now I want to just take it a little aside right here, a little rabbit trail if you'll indulge me. Have you ever thought about this? I think about this all the time. Something powerful and spiritual happens whenever we share food and drink together. Have you noticed this? When we gather together as human beings, whether you're a Christian or not, when we gather together around a dinner table, something powerful and potentially spiritual happens. There's just something God built into breaking bread together. I think when I am eating in community, food tastes better. Would you agree with me? I was having this conversation with somebody this week, and we were talking about some of our most memorable meals. I want you to think back. What would you say your most memorable meal? What's the first thing that pops into your mind? Just think for a minute. What is your most memorable meal of your life? Okay, you got it? You got it in your head? Now let me ask you the question. Is it memorable because of the food, or is it memorable because of who you were with? Or is it both? I was telling the story, my most memorable meal, Chris, the first thing that popped into my mind was when we were with Jay and Cheryl in Malaysia. And we were scuba diving in Malaysia. This was 20 plus years ago. We were scuba diving in Malaysia, and every night the fishermen would come in and park their boats on the beach. I mean, there were no docks or anything. They would just beach their boats, and they would sell the fish they caught that day on the beach. They would wrap them up in banana leaves and roast them over an open fire. And the first meal that popped into my mind, Chris, was that night that we ate barracuda with Jay and Cheryl. Has anybody else ever eaten barracuda? Where in the world do you ever get an opportunity to eat barracuda? It's not at Dave's Sushi, let me tell you right now. It was an absolutely extraordinary thing, not just because the barracuda tasted so good, but because we were having this extraordinary community building experience that was centered around food and drink. Food tastes better. The conversation is better. Have you noticed this? Conversation is better when you have food and drink. I'm not sure why it is. Probably because you have something to distract you from the awkwardness of the conversation. When you're sharing a meal together, you slow down. You get comfortable. You tell stories. You know what this is? This is communion. Whether or not you've got a little cup of grape juice and you've got a little tiny broken up cracker, when you are with other believers and you're sharing food and drink together, you are communing together. And when you welcome Jesus into the mix, there's something spiritual that begins to take place. Communion. It's community. Do you notice that those two words have the same root word? Commune. And here's the deal. Today we're having this connection event out at the Riojas's place. And we can all go out there like we do every summer. I've lost track of how many summers we've done this out there. We can go out there this afternoon and we can go through the line and we can get burgers and dogs and fill up our plates with potato salad and watermelon. There's going to be lots of watermelon. I'm just praying for deviled eggs. Sorry, I'm a broken record. And we can huddle in our little family groups and the people that we're comfortable with. Or we can start to expand our circle this afternoon and begin to practice communion as a church family. We're not going to have grape juice and broken bread today. We're just going to have regular old potluck church food. But we're going to practice communion today. And I want to give you a strategy, okay? I want to give you a strategy today and just put out a challenge. Sometimes we get to these events and we get shy. Am I the only one? I struggle with this too. I get shy, okay? And it's just easy to just hang out with the people that I know well because the conversation is easy. I want to give you a strategy today. Would you find somebody that you don't know well? It could be somebody you've met before. It could be a complete stranger. And this is what I want to suggest you do today. I want you to ask this person that you don't know well a specific question. And if you have a hard time remembering, you can write this down. Here's your question today. This is your assignment for this afternoon's connecting event. You ready for this? Here's your question. What's your story? Now, this is a strategic question, and we use this all the time in our small group. Our small group is going to start middle of September. Our small group is for anybody who is new to Connect or anybody who has never been to Chris and my small group in our home, okay? We use this question all the time. What's your story? And then people will say, well, what part of my story do you want me to tell? Because, if you're like 30 years old, there's 30 years of story, right? The idea is they can tell any part of their story they want. So if somebody walks up to you today, this afternoon, and says, what's your story? You can tell them any part of your story you want to tell them. You could tell them your growing up story. What was your family of origin like? You could tell them how you came to know Jesus. What were the circumstances that led you to the point where you are today in your spiritual journey? You could tell them how you found Connect. You could tell them the story about how you got lost trying to find the Riojas' house, and so you're 15 minutes late. Okay? It's completely up to you, whatever story you want to tell them. But listen, if you'll just ask that strategic question, what's your story? You're going to find yourself in the middle of a rich, significant, beautiful conversation. And if you're able to find out a little bit about Jesus in this person's life, what's going to happen is communion. It's going to be beautiful. How many of you, I'm going to ask you for a commitment, okay? And I'm going to say, yes, I see that hand, and then we're going to have an altar call. Just kidding. I'm going to ask you for a commitment. How many of you will ask the question to somebody today, what's your story? Come on. I'm going to need more than that number of hands, okay? Come on. What's your story? Okay, great. Now, if you didn't raise your hand, you have to answer the question. You get to tell your story, okay? I think we're going to have a great time this afternoon communing together with food and drink. Listen, my aim, and this is why we have connecting events. I want you to meet somebody today. You might find your new best friend today. You might find somebody that you're going to join a small group with today. And my aim is that every connector will participate in a small group starting this fall where spiritual growth is pursued. Now, I want to take you to one more part of the scriptures where we see small groups and large groups happening. And it's the early church. Here's what I discovered this week in my study. New Testament believers, just like Old Testament believers, gathered in large groups and in small groups. Large groups and in small groups. I want to take you to Acts chapter 2, where we find this account of the early gatherings of the followers of Jesus. Here's what we read. All the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to sharing in meals, including the Lord's Supper, and to prayer, and to asking the question, what's your story? A deep sense of awe came over them all. I thought you would laugh there, but that's okay. A deep sense of awe came over them all, and the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders. Now, watch. All the believers met together in one place and shared everything they had. This is the big gathering. This is like Connect Sunday morning gatherings. They sold their property and possessions and shared the money with those in need. They worshiped together at the temple each day, and they met in homes for the Lord's Supper and shared their meals with great joy and generosity. There's their small groups. Right from the beginning of Jesus' church, they were meeting as large groups and in small groups. The next verse says, all the while they were praising God and enjoying the goodwill of all the people, and each day the Lord added to their fellowship those who were being saved. It's just an extraordinary story, because these people were all in for spiritual growth together in large groups and in small groups. Now I can just hear this morning a busy connector in this room, or maybe you're online, asking, man, how much is too much? Because you know what? I'm busy. I've got a job. I've got a family. I've got game night on Monday night. I like to go out on Fridays. I'm busy. And you're telling me that those early church people, they were together in the temple every day and they met in small groups and peoples? Man, that's a lot. You know, I can give a Sunday morning 90 minutes 2 or 3 times a month. Pastor Russ, you're just asking too much. Fair enough. Let me take you to Acts chapter 20. How much is too much? Look at this. This is Luke now telling his personal story. On the first day of the week, we gathered with local believers to share the Lord's Supper. Paul was preaching to them, and since he was leaving the next day, he kept talking until midnight. You guys would leave if that was me, but I'm not the Apostle Paul. The upstairs room where he met was lighted with many flickering lamps. You got the picture? As Paul spoke on and on, a young man named Eutychus, sitting on the windowsill, became very drowsy, and finally he fell sound asleep and dropped 3 stories to his death below. Paul went down, bent over him, and took him into his arms. "Don't worry," he said, "he's alive." And then they all went back upstairs, shared in the Lord's Supper, and ate together. And Paul continued talking to them until dawn, and then he left. And meanwhile, the young man was taken home alive and well, and everyone was greatly relieved. How much is too much? For these people, there was not too much. Why? Because they were pursuing spiritual growth together. And they were remembering the new covenant of Jesus that said there's mercy for anybody that will call on the name of Jesus. Is there anything more important than passing on this message to our friends and our neighbors and our relatives and to anybody who's spiritually hungry, that there is mercy for you because of Jesus? Is there anything more important? Would you be willing to listen to me ramble on and on until dawn, until somebody fell 3 stories to their death? Or is it just too much? Evidently, it was too much for some people, because several decades later, the writer of the book of Hebrews wrote this: "Let us not neglect our meeting together as some people do." Evidently, it was too much for some people. "But rather, let's encourage one another, especially now that the day of the return of Jesus is drawing near." Now, listen, I'm casting a big picture here. And I'm not suggesting we start meeting here every single day and meet in small groups every single night. I'm not suggesting that. But I am asking you to take inventory of your life and ask yourself, am I devoting enough time to spiritual growth? Am I devoting enough time to my own spiritual growth as well as investing in the lives of the next generation of believers who are going to follow Jesus? Is it possible that Jesus is calling me to raise the bar in my own life and in my own time commitment? Is that possible? Here's the reality. Most of us believe this. This is a common mindset. Balance is health. That probably resonates with most of you. And most of you would say, I really need to seek balance. I need to balance family life and church life, and I need to balance all these things. A couple of weeks ago, our staff was at the Global Leadership Summit. One of my favorite speakers, Marcus Buckingham, addressed this issue: balance is health. He said, no, that's not true. He said, motion is health. And then he followed up with this statement. I wrote it down word for word. Balance is stasis. Nothing alive in nature is balanced. Everything that is healthy is moving. Now, lots of us feel like we've got to get our life in balance. I would suggest this to you. I think what we need to do is, if we're frustrated and we're tired and we're burned out, it's because we're not moving in the direction of what is most important to us. And it's not that you need balance, it's that you need to decide what is most important and move in the direction of that goal. If your goal is spiritual growth, you're not going to get spiritual growth with balance. You're only going to grow if you're moving intentionally towards spiritual growth. And my aim is that every single connector will participate in a small group where spiritual growth is being pursued together. So here's our strategy. I know you were wondering, what's our strategy? Here's our strategy. We have 2 spiritual growth strategies. We have Sunday morning gatherings. Man, I'm glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here. And maybe your strategy, maybe what you'll do is you're going to say, man, I'm going to bump up my commitment to Sunday mornings. That would be awesome. Those of you that are joining us online, I'm so glad that you have prioritized this time to join us online today. You're probably busy, or maybe you can't leave the house today, or whatever it is, but you took the time to click in and to join us here today. Good job. I'm so glad you're here. Sunday morning is so valuable. And we worship together. Man, was worship awesome this morning? You can worship to K-Love if you want. There's nothing like joining together with your brothers and sisters and worshiping together. We come together and we learn together, and we're heading in a common direction as a church. Sunday gatherings are very valuable, but listen, don't dismiss connection groups. Can I ask you to begin to pray about your involvement in a connection group this fall? I'll give you a little bit of a preview. Starting September 15th, we're going to launch into our next teaching series, and I'm titling this teaching series, The Jesus Way. The Jesus Way, and that's also the week that many of our small groups will launch, September 15th. Our small group semester this fall is going to be between 8 and 10 weeks, depending on what our small groups do. And like we've done the last several semesters, I'm providing a discussion guide that will go along with our Sunday morning messages. And somebody asked me this morning if I printed some out, and I didn't print any out, but next week I will have some samples for you to see. I haven't finished the discussion guide yet, but I've got a bunch of it done. It will be done by September 15th. Okay? And every week in our small groups that are doing the Jesus Way, there will be a deeper dive into what it means to be a follower of Jesus. We're going to be talking about things like, what does it mean to be forgiven and to forgive others? What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to wear the name of Christ? What does it mean to bear one another's burdens? It's going to be kind of a topical study through the Gospels and the book of Acts, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. But we're going to talk about, what does it mean to walk in the way of Jesus? It is going to be such a great opportunity for you to gather in a small group and take a deeper dive in where our whole Connect Church family is going. We'll have a break in the middle. I should mention this. There will be a break in the middle because in October, Eugene Bach is going to be our guest, along with, goosebumps, along with the grandson of the Ayatollah of Iran, who has given his life to Jesus. We are going to be the first church on his book tour. Makes me emotional. You guys, good things are coming. These groups that are doing the Jesus Way will be finished by Thanksgiving. And so if you're one of those connectors asking, how much is too much? Listen, I'll give you December off so you can do all your Christmas stuff. But we're not going to stop growing in December, and we're going to pick it back up in January. But we need more connection group leaders. Remember when I said we've got around 300 people that make Connect Church their home? If we were to serve every single connector with a connection group, we would need about 30 groups. We don't have that many yet. So one of the things I want to ask some of you is, if you have a spiritual gift of leadership, or if you've ever led groups before, or if you've been a part of a group and you just have this in your spirit, that maybe you should lead a group, would you consider maybe taking a risk and putting your name out there to start leading your group? Our group from last year has given birth to a new group, and Sean and Becky Searle are going to lead a group for the first time starting in September. Okay, wave at everybody, you guys. Not all of you know Sean and Becky. They're awesome leaders, and they're going to be group leaders for the first. Have you ever led groups before, you guys? Okay, so not the first time for you, but first time at Connect. I'm just so excited. So good. So we need more group leaders. So if you have any desire to lead a group, I made some really technologically advanced and super creative sign-up sheets, old school. There's lines for you to write your name down on, okay? Chris is modeling them back there. Would you consider leading a group? Now, listen. There's going to be other groups this fall, so not everything might not be the Jesus way. And there's going to be other groups. I don't see Missy Bell here, but Missy Bell leads a group, and they've been going for years, Hearts for Prayer. They just gather every week, and they pray, and they intercede, and they go on prayer walks. It's a great group. Jason and Kim Bennett, wave at us, Jason and Kim. They're going to start a marriage group starting the 1st of October, okay? Building health into marriages. I can't even tell you how excited I am for this. Okay, some connectors, and this is a really good thing. Some connectors are a part of small groups outside of Connect, and I know this is lots of you. Bible Study Fellowship has been a group of women that take deep dives into the Bible. Sarah, you're still a part of Bible Study Fellowship, are you not? Community Bible study. If you're interested, this is inductive Bible study. Do I understand this correctly? Okay, Sarah could tell you a little bit more about that, and that's not a Connect ministry, but it is so valuable. Over the years, we've had a lot of moms at Connect that have joined over at Journey Church for MOPS, which stands for Mothers of Preschoolers. And so you have opportunities, even outside of Connect, to join with other believers for spiritual growth. One of the best small group practitioners that I know of is our local Chi Alpha chapter at MSU. They do small groups better than anybody I know. Tyler, I'm looking for you. Join me real quickly, would you please? My leg got real stiff sitting there. Sometimes my quadriceps just doesn't want to fire. I have to tell it, you're going to move now, and heel, toe, all that. Okay, I digress. Tyler, you've been a small group leader here at Connect, but you were trained as a small group leader in your years at MSU through Chi Alpha. The question that I wanted to start with, I'm so impressed with, one of the reasons I'm so impressed with Chi Alpha groups is because they tend to stay together. And here at Connect, we have a group of former Chi Alpha-ers who formed at MSU, and they're still meeting together on a regular basis years after, okay? This is healthy small group culture. And what I wanted to ask you is, what is Chi Alpha's secret sauce for small groups?
Well, a sauce is not one ingredient, right? It's a couple ingredients. And it starts with the expectation. You come to Chi Alpha your freshman year, week one, you're getting in a small group whether you like it or not, right? Now, there is explanation given, right? Really, it comes down to if you want spiritual life that is to the fullest abundance that God has for you, you need to be in a small group. You have to. This Sunday gathering isn't going to cut it. I think all of us in this room understand that, in our various walks with the Lord as well. So that's the first part. Secondly, you come to a small group, you have a choice. You have the choice to be vulnerable with those in that group, or you have the choice to show up, go through the motions. I checked the box, I came to my small group, I maybe did the reading throughout the week, and we'll call it a day. That's great. That's also not living out to the fullest of that abundance, right? And so there is this expectation that you're going to come, and through time, that vulnerability is going to be cultivated. It's not the expectation on day one or week one, but with time, the expectation, the hope is that we're going to be vulnerable with you as leaders, and we expect that and ask of that in return as well. Those would be, I think, the two key ingredients, at least. Yeah.
The other day you shared something else with me that I thought was powerful. The people that led aren't expected to be experts.
Yes. Yeah. In the Chi Alpha ministry as well, you've got these amazing students that have been going through the ministry, and at some point after that first year, it's asked, all right, are you ready to lead a group? Most people, no, I'm not ready to lead a group. What are you talking about? And it's not that we're asking you to be a theologian. I'm not asking you to know all of the Greek roots of every, word in the Bible or anything, but we do ask that you're willing to step out and love people well. Now you're doing it in the context of, I'm going to also deep dive these topics with you as a group as well. But what I found was the most amazing conversations took place when, as a leader, you would sit down and say, I've been reading this all week and I don't understand it. Is there anyone else that doesn't understand it? And typically, yeah, everyone does. All right, then we're going to dive into it. We're going to figure it out, and we're going to try and understand what this passage is talking about. And that is what the expectation is of a leader of a small group. It's the willingness to say, I don't know what the answer is, or I didn't read this week. Is there someone else that did read this week? What did you guys see? And here's why, what I had going on throughout the week that was so hard. It's rarely, I feel like, does it camp out on what the topic was for the week. It quickly can expand into what's the real life hardships that we're all walking through that are having an impact.
And this is a takeaway that I want connectors to grab. You don't have to be an expert to lead. You just need to have the humility to say, I don't know the answer, but let's figure it out together. Yeah. Okay. It's great. One more question and then we'll close. What are the benefits that are keeping students together even after graduation?
Yeah. It comes from this place of, I've done life with these people. I've allowed them to see my weaknesses. I've been able to celebrate our victories together, and we've mourned our losses as well. And that when you have experienced that and you have walked in that, it's not something you're willing to just let go of and not continue to invest in. And better yet, it doesn't mean that I have to continue doing it with that group. I've got a group that I was a part of for several years, and life circumstances changed, and really it came down to I wanted to be more involved in this community as well. And I wanted to have that opportunity there and invest in the people that are here and hear new stories, experience new friendships and relationship. It comes to a point, if you're willing to take the step to dive all the way in and take the risk, it's going to pay dividends. Point out to me where it is that Jesus says, I want you to walk and do something that you're really comfortable with. There's nothing that he ever asks of us that's going to be comfortable. And so I would ask that, as I just said that, if you're wrestling with the idea of being a leader and the one thing that's holding you back is because it would be uncomfortable, maybe pray on that this week. And likewise, if stepping into a group and just partaking in a group, if the one thing that's holding you back is that's going to be uncomfortable, maybe that's exactly where God's wanting you to be.
Good word, Tyler. Thank you. I think that was a prophetic word for a bunch of us here today. All right. We need more group leaders. If you want some time to pray about it, please do. Our sign-up sheets will be there for the next couple of weeks. We'll be getting all of our groups organized. You can start signing up in a couple of weeks. There's nothing to sign up for now. I just want you to know it's coming. This is our strategy. This is our purpose. And this afternoon, we're going to go and we're going to commune this afternoon. Good food, good conversation. What's your question? What's your story? All right. Lord, thank you for meeting with us here today. Thank you, Lord, that you have laid out a strategy for spiritual growth. Thank you, Lord, for the truth that you want us to grow. We want to grow. We want to know you. We want to walk in the Jesus way. And we want to be everything you've created us to be. It's for your name and for your purposes, we pray. Amen. All right. See you over at Rio Houses real soon.